I'm delighted to say that joining me now is the Deputy Leader of the Opposition in the Senate and Shadow Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, Michaelia Cash. Michaelia, great to see you. How are you?
Great to see you. Absolutely fabulous, Rowan.
OK, so isn't now the time to finally allow pensioners to do part-time work without being penalised on their pensions? Couldn't this be a number one priority?
Rowan, if you were behaving like a Prime Minister as opposed to an opposition leader, you would have already implemented this policy. There is a skills shortage in Australia. We have unemployment at record levels. Mr Albanese was part of the opposition for 9 long years. They get elected to government, and in fact, if you recall, they made 4 promises to the Australian people. The first was that if you elected an Albanese government, tick, they'd increase your wages. Secondly, they'd tackle the skills shortage. Thirdly, they'd reduce your power bill, and they were quite specific here, by $275 per year. And fourthly, they would tackle inflation. They have been elected to govern. They have been in office now for a number of months, and yet all we see is we have a skills summit next week where we're bringing a whole lot of people together, 30% being unions, to put together policy parameters that they can then analyse. Honestly, Mr Albanese needs to get over being an opposition leader. He has been elected Prime Minister and start governing this country.
Hear, hear. Well, I don't get it, and many Australians are puzzled why there are so many people on unemployment benefits, Michaelia, but there are also so many job shortages. That doesn't add up. Explain.
No, and it doesn't. And often what you'll see is those who are now on the unemployment benefits are often not in a position to take up the work. And the former government, as you know, we invested heavily in employment programs. We invested heavily in skills programs to really focus on these people because they do have those additional barriers. But what you're also seeing is this: if businesses cannot get access to the labour that they need, they're not going to be able to increase their productivity. They're not going to be able to undertake that additional shift. And there are 2 policies that are blindingly obvious to any Australian. The first is the policy that has been put forward by Peter Dutton, which you referred to. You've got a ready-made workforce in pensioners and veterans who are screaming out for the ability to undertake that additional day per week without affecting their pension. And Peter Dutton's been pretty upfront with Mr Albanese. Just implement it. Just implement it. We'll almost give you credit for it. Just implement it.
Just do it.
And yet Mr Albanese says he's got to go to a job summit to talk about it.
Yes, and I wonder who will be sitting on the beanbags, do you think, Michaelia? Will it be Kate Blanchett and Kevin Rudd and all the usual Labor hangers on?
This is the problem is, Mr Albanese wants to be like so many former Prime Ministers, but he's got to be the Prime Minister that was elected by the Australian people today. He's got to stop being the opposition leader and start governing. Can I tell you though, Rowan, a really worrying statistic is this. Out of the invitations which have been issued, 30% are going to the unions, 30% to business. I'd like to know the policy rationale behind how you got to 30% unions and 30% business, because business are the employers of every other Australian in the country. Why is it that you're not inviting every other business to this job summit? And I'd really be, interested to know what was this policy rationale behind these figures, because to date we haven't been told that.
So, Michaelia, according to the Sydney Morning Herald, there's a poll out there that people are expecting from this job summit higher wages. And you're right, that's one of the things that Labor promised, higher wages to get elected. People don't want more immigration yet. That's what the business councils are asking for. People want higher wages. Yet, if you recall, Albo, who tries to mimic, pretend he's Bob Hawke or Paul Keating, in the last job summit, Michaelia, which was Labor's job summit with Hawke and Keating, they didn't raise wages, they cut wages.
That is exactly right. History may well repeat itself. Mr Albanese likes to pretend to be a lot of things, in particular an opposition leader. He is now the Prime Minister of this country. He went to the election saying specifically to the Australian people, if you elect me, Anthony Albanese, as your Prime Minister, I will ensure you get a pay rise. And yet they are now crab walking away from that. Mr Albanese needs to also understand that despite the demands of the unions, small business are the backbone of the Australian economy, and a business that has to close employs no one. And Mr Albanese needs to stop acting like the Leader of the Opposition and start governing, behave like a Prime Minister.
And just very quickly before we go, Michaelia, it strikes me as quite bizarre that we're embarking on this insane renewables push, closing down coal mines. None of the fossil fuel giants have been, or even the big four banks have been invited to this summit, yet we rely here in Australia on fossil fuels and the jobs and the money that comes into this country, yet they've been excluded from the Jobs Summit. Do you think this summit's going to be a success, as Albo has already nominated it to be?
I think Mr Albanese said it will set policy parameters. Australia does not need policy parameters. Australia needs policy action, and there are two policies out there, the veterans and the pensioners, and the increase in immigration, that Mr Albanese could have actioned tomorrow. Start being a Prime Minister, start governing this country.
Michaelia Cash, great to speak to you. Keep well and we'll
Great
chat soon.
to be with you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.